They were two of the greatest performers who ever lived. One commanded stages with voice and piano. The other made guitars scream and cry. But in 1969, before Queen existed, before Bohemian Rhapsody, Freddie Mercury challenged Jimi Hendrix to a musical duel. "Piano has more range than guitar," Freddie said. What Jimi played next changed Freddie's entire approach to music, and nobody knew about it until Brian May told the story in 2001. It was April 1969, and London was the center of the musical universe. The Beatles were recording Abbey Road, the Rolling Stones were everywhere, and Jimi Hendrix, already a legend at 26, was using Trident Studios to work on new material that would eventually become the album Band of Gypsies. Trident Studios was the most advanced recording facility in Europe. 4 tracks, state-of-the-art equipment, and a Steinway grand piano that had been played by everyone from the Beatles to David Bowie. The studio had a policy that young musicians could book late-night sessions at reduced rates, which is how a 22-year-old art student named Farrokh Bulsara managed to get in the door. Freddie Mercury didn't exist yet. This young man still went by his birth name, still had long, straight hair instead of the iconic mustache and shortcut, and was years away from forming Queen. But he had something that nobody could miss: absolute confidence in his own abilities, bordering on arrogance. On this particular evening, Freddie had booked a midnight to 3 a.m. session to practice on the Steinway. He arrived at 11:30, eager to get started, and found the studio still occupied. Through the control room window, he could see Jimi Hendrix in the live room, working through a guitar part, his afro silhouetted against the studio lights. Most people would have waited quietly. Freddie walked straight into the control room. "How much longer?" he asked the engineer, Pete Brown, who was still adjusting levels. "Jimmy's got the room until midnight," Pete said, not looking up. "You've got to wait." "Well, could you tell him to hurry up? I have work to do." Pete finally looked at Freddie, surprised at the audacity. "You want me to tell Jimi Hendrix to hurry up?" "Yes, I paid for my session time." Pete shook his head, but pressed the talkback button. "Jimmy, there's a kid out here who's got the room at midnight. Says he needs you to wrap up." Through the speakers, Jimmy's voice came back, amused. "A kid? How old is this kid?" 22, Freddie called out, loud enough for the microphone to pick up. "And I'm not a kid. I'm a musician." There was a pause, then Jimmy's voice again. "Tell him to come in here." Freddie didn't hesitate. He walked into the live room like he belonged there, like he wasn't talking to one of the most famous musicians in the world. Jimi was sitting on a stool, his white Stratocaster across his lap, looking at Freddie with curiosity. "You're a musician?" asked Jimi. "Yes, piano and voice." "What kind of music you play?" "Everything. Opera, rock, whatever moves me. I'm studying design, but music is what I'm meant to do."
Jimi smiled at the confidence. "You got a band?" "Working on it. I'm looking for the right people. It's hard to find musicians who can match my vision." "Your vision," Jimi repeated, his smile widening. "And what's that vision?" "To be the greatest performer who ever lived, to make music that matters, to be remembered forever." Most people would have laughed. Jimi didn't. He saw something in this brash young man that reminded him of himself at that age, the absolute certainty, the unwillingness to accept limitations. "That's a big vision," Jimi said. "You think you got what it takes?" "I know I do. Piano has everything guitar doesn't. More range, more complexity, more power. A piano has 88 keys. Your guitar only has 6 strings. How can 6 strings compete with that?" The room went very quiet. Pete Brown, listening from the control room, later said his heart stopped. Nobody challenged Jimi Hendrix, not about guitar, but this kid had just walked in and essentially said the piano was superior. Jimi looked at Freddie for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked over to his amplifier, and turned it on. He adjusted a few settings on his pedals, wah-wah, fuzz, univibe. Then he looked at Freddie and said, "Sit down and watch." Freddie sat on the piano bench, arms crossed, ready to be proven right. What happened in the next 4 minutes changed everything Freddie thought he knew about music. Jimi started with a single note, just one, but he didn't just play it. He bent it, raised it a full step, brought it back down, added vibrato that made it sing and shimmer. That single note became 10 different notes through his control alone. Then he hit the wah-wah pedal, and suddenly that note was talking, crying, laughing. Freddie's arms slowly uncrossed. Jimi moved into a melody, but it wasn't like any melody Freddie had heard on guitar before. Jimi was using the full range of the instrument, hitting bass notes with his thumb while playing melody with his fingers, creating 2 parts simultaneously. It sounded like 2 guitarists playing at once. Then Jimi started using harmonics, touching the strings at precise points to create bell-like overtones that shouldn't be possible on a guitar. The sound filled the studio, shimmering and ethereal like a choir of angels. He layered feedback, controlling it so precisely that it became musical, not noise. Each note rang with overtones, creating chords where there should only be single notes. Freddie leaned forward, his analytical mind trying to understand how this was possible. He'd studied music theory. He knew what instruments could and couldn't do, and what he was hearing shouldn't be possible on 6 strings. Jimi moved through styles, blues, jazz, classical, rock, proving that the guitar could speak any musical language. He played passages that sounded like piano runs, arpeggios that cascaded like waterfalls. He used the guitar's volume knob as an instrument itself, swelling notes in and out to create an orchestral effect. Then he did something that made Freddie gasp audibly. Using 2-hand tapping, harmonics, and his whammy bar, Jimi created a passage that sounded exactly like a piano. The clarity, the multiple voices, the harmonic complexity, it was all there. He was playing the limitations of the guitar against itself, using them to create something that transcended the instrument.
For the finale, Jimi held one chord and used every technique in his arsenal. Bending, sliding, tapping, harmonic feedback, wah-wah manipulation to make that single chord evolve into an entire composition. It was like watching a painter start with one color and somehow create a full rainbow. When Jimi finished, he set his guitar on the stand and looked at Freddie. 6 strings, he said quietly, but the range isn't in the instrument. It's in the musician. You can have 88 keys and say nothing, or you can have 6 strings and say everything. Freddie sat in silence. His face had gone from confident to stunned to something like enlightened. The arrogance had been completely stripped away, replaced by genuine awe. "How did you do that?" Freddie finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Same way you'll do what you're meant to do," Jimi said. "Stop counting keys and start finding your voice. The instrument doesn't matter. The soul matters." Freddie stood up, walked over to Jimi, and extended his hand. "I'm sorry, I was being an arrogant fool. What you just played, I've never heard anything like that in my life." Jimi shook his hand. "Don't apologize for confidence. You're going to need it where you're going. But remember this, the greatest musicians don't compete with other instruments. They learn from them. Go play your piano. Show me what 88 keys can do." Freddie sat at the Steinway, his hands shaking slightly. He started to play, but something was different now. He'd walked into this room thinking about technical superiority, about range and complexity, but Jimi had just taught him that music wasn't about what you could play, it was about what you made people feel. Freddie played a simple melody, nothing fancy, no showing off, just a beautiful, emotional progression that filled the room with longing. When he finished, Jimi nodded slowly. "See, that's the difference. When you walked in here, you were thinking like a technician. Now you're feeling like a musician. Don't lose that."
They talked for another hour, Freddie's midnight session completely forgotten. Jimi told him about finding your authentic voice, about not being afraid to be theatrical, about using every weapon in your arsenal, voice, instrument, stage presence, visual presentation, to create something unforgettable. You said you want to be remembered forever, then be bigger than life. Be so big they can't forget you, but always, always serve the music first. The theatrics are just the delivery system for the emotion. Freddie absorbed every word like gospel. This was the lesson he didn't know he needed from a teacher he hadn't expected to find. When Jimi finally left around 2 a.m., he paused at the door. "What's your name, kid? Your real name, not the one you're going to use." "Farouk Bulsara." "That's a mouthful. You should get a stage name, something people will remember." "I'm working on it." Jimi smiled. "Good luck, Farouk. I think you're going to be something special. Just remember, it's not about the keys or the strings. It's about what you say with them." After Jimi left, Freddie sat at the piano until dawn, playing and thinking. Everything he'd believed about music had been challenged in one night. He'd thought technical superiority mattered most. Jimi had shown him emotion mattered more. He'd thought instruments competed. Jimi had shown them they collaborated. He'd thought he needed to prove his greatness. Jimi had shown him he needed to feel his greatness. Pete Brown, the engineer who witnessed all of this, recorded most of the session. That tape sat in his personal collection for decades. In 2001, 2 years before his death, Brian May was researching Freddie's early years for a Queen documentary. Pete contacted him and said, "I have something you need to hear." When Brian listened to the tape, Jimi's 4-minute demonstration, Freddie's odd response, their conversation, he said he finally understood where certain Queen techniques had come from. Freddie always talked about finding different voices within a single instrument, Brian said in a 2001 interview. The way he'd layer piano parts, the way he'd use one instrument to sound like 3. "I always wondered where that came from. Now I know." Jimi showed him that night that limitation is just a starting point for creativity. Brian also revealed that Freddie had told him about this encounter years later, in the late 1970s, after Queen had become massive. Freddie had said, "I walked into that studio thinking I knew everything about music. Jimi Hendrix taught me that I knew nothing, and that lesson made me a better musician than I ever would have been otherwise." The influence shows up everywhere in Freddie's work. The way he'd use a single piano to create orchestral effects, the way he'd layer vocals to sound like entire choirs, the way he'd use dynamics and space to make simple parts sound huge. These weren't piano techniques he'd learned in school. These were lessons about transcending your instrument that Jimi had demonstrated with 6 strings. In Bohemian Rhapsody, when Freddie creates that massive operatic middle section, he's using the same principle Jimi showed him, taking the limitations of your tools and making them work for you instead of against you. The piano couldn't sound like a full opera chorus, but Freddie made it sound that way through creativity and vision. When Queen performed at Live Aid in 1985, many critics called it the greatest rock performance of all time. Freddie commanded Wembley Stadium the way Jimi had commanded that studio, not through technical showing off, but through emotional connection. Every gesture, every note, every interaction with the crowd served the music first. "That's what Jimi taught me," Freddie told Brian after Live Aid. "That performance isn't about you showing off how good you are. It's about you connecting with people on a level that transcends the technical." The sad irony is that Freddie and Jimi never got to work together. Jimi died in September 1970, just as Queen was forming, but the influence lasted decades. Every time Freddie sat at a piano, he was using lessons he'd learned from a guitarist. Every time he approached a song, he thought about what Jimi had said. It's not about what you can play, it's about what you make people feel. In 1991, as Freddie was dying, Brian asked him if he had any regrets. Freddie said, "I wish I could have thanked Jimi Hendrix properly. I wish I could have shown him what I became because of what he taught me. I walked into that studio an arrogant boy, thinking piano was superior to guitar. I left as a musician who understood that no instrument is superior, only the artist using it."
That tape Pete Brown recorded sat in the Queen archives for years after Brian retrieved it. In 2011, for the 40th anniversary of Queen, they released a boxed set that included a few seconds of audio from that night. Just Jimi's voice saying, "It's not about the keys or the strings, it's about what you say with them." Hearing Jimi Hendrix teach Freddie Mercury about music is like overhearing two gods discuss creation. It's a reminder that even legends learn from each other, that even the greatest performers started somewhere, challenged by someone who helped them see a better way. Today, when guitar players argue about whether 6 strings is limiting, someone always brings up Jimi. And when piano players argue about their instrument's superiority, someone always brings up what Jimi taught Freddie, that range isn't measured in keys or strings, it's measured in emotion, creativity, and the courage to make your instrument say what your soul is feeling. Freddie Mercury became one of the greatest performers who ever lived. He commanded stages like royalty. He made the piano do things it wasn't supposed to do. He created music that will genuinely last forever. And according to Brian May, it all started with a lesson from a guitarist who proved that 6 strings could say everything 88 keys could say, and more. Freddie never forgot that night, Brian said. Every time he did something unexpected with the piano, every time he found a new voice in the instrument, he was channeling what Jimi showed him. That's Jimi's secret legacy, not just the music he made, but the musicians he inspired to think differently about their own instruments. The challenge Freddie threw at Jimi that night could have been a moment of embarrassment. Instead, it became a moment of enlightenment. Because Jimi didn't just prove Freddie wrong, he showed him a better way to be right, not through technical superiority, but through emotional truth. And that's the lesson that created Queen. If this story moved you, remember, the greatest teachers are the ones who challenge your assumptions and show you that what you thought were limitations are actually opportunities. Subscribe for more untold stories about the moments when legends taught each other how to be legendary.